It's been a long time since I've made one of these videos. It's been 6 months, believe it or not, and I meant to have made this video a lot sooner, around when I finished my full AC Unity review, but I've been heavily considering what to do with this series. As you know, if you've watched one of these videos in the past, I usually use a scoring system to rate the games in different categories and whatnot, and then determine a winner based on that. However, the scoring system was always one way or another flawed, and I kept changing the basis for it because the points didn't necessarily always convey my opinion. For example, one game could have an incredible story, but the gameplay and world are average at best, and then another game could be decent at everything, but overall I may still prefer that game with the incredible story because that's what I prefer in a game. But in the scoring, the game that was decent at everything would win because it got better scores all around. So I felt it was hard to get that scoring system to reflect my opinion. So instead, I figured I should just compare the games on their numerous subjects, and then at the end give my opinion on which game I think is better and why. No scoring or fancy BS, just objectively comparing two games. But that aside, today we are comparing two Assassin's Creed games that share the same birthday, Assassin's Creed Unity and Assassin's Creed Rogue. Both games are considered by many, including myself, to be pretty underrated games in the series. Well, I don't really know about Unity anymore. There gets to a point where so many people call something underrated that you can't really consider it underrated anymore because so many people are now singing its praises. But regardless, both of these games had disappointing launches to say the least, and them releasing on the same day ended up causing harm to both games with not only their sales but the game's states. However, now of course in 2022, these two games are both held in quite high regard by the community, which was certainly not the case over 8 years ago. So which of these underdogs is the better game? Well, let's first delve into their respective stories. It's I make my own luck versus, well, Arno doesn't really have a catchphrase. Hey Connor, help me out here, why don't you?
Give me Lee!
Connor, how many times do I have to tell you that I don't have a Lee? Nobody has a Lee. They're out of stock. You killed them all. No more Charles Lee. Oh, shut up. Anyways, I'm very curious who people prefer between Arno and Shay as protagonists. I actually did a video not too long ago where I had a little fantasy matchup speculating who would win in a fight between Arno and Shay. I basically said if we had Shay in his prime versus Arno in his prime, Shay would probably win, and a lot of you agreed with me, but then I did a poll and Arno won quite handedly, despite the fact most of the comments were on Shay's side. Regardless though, that has nothing to do with who makes the better character and protagonist for this series. And honestly, if I ever rank the protagonists in Assassin's Creed, these two would rank very similarly. I personally don't find either of them to be among the best of the best with the Ezio's and Bayek's, but I wouldn't put them towards the bottom with the rejects either. They both likely would fall somewhere in the middle to me. Shay is obviously one of the series' most unique protagonists, being the only Templar protagonist in the franchise, and I definitely appreciated the fresh take and twist on the Assassin versus Templar conflict with his character. In fact, for some people, Shay is their favorite protagonist in Assassin's Creed for that very reason. I see a lot of love for Rogue and Shay these days, which is really great to see. I think probably the biggest crime when it comes to Rogue and its story though is how short it is. Shay was a very interesting character. He went through quite a lot during Rogue, and his character had so much potential had the story been longer or was expanded upon in a possible sequel. A common trend you'll notice with protagonists in this series. A lot of them felt like they needed and had the potential for sequels, especially Arno and Shay, but they just never got them. Now, you didn't hear this from me, but the word is Ubisoft had a sequel curse placed upon them, so they may never do their characters justice again. Anyways, the point is, I very much like both Arno and Shay, but Arno obviously got a much bigger character arc in Unity and lots more time to be fleshed out that Shay didn't get. Now, in his limited time, Shay was great. I mean, the guy makes his own luck for crying out loud, but something's sort of come to bother me about Rogue's story, and that's how the assassins in it are portrayed. Don't get me wrong, I love the idea of flipping the perspective and showing us that there's some gray area between both the Assassins and the Templars, but when you really think about it, the Assassins' motives don't make tons of sense, and I suppose you could chalk that up to Achilles and his arrogance as a leader. It is touched on very briefly early on when Achilles' son dies. I feel like that should have had more focus. It was just like a little throwaway line between Shay and Liam on the Morrigan, but it does explain what led to the change in Achilles and why he became the kind of person he did in Rogue. Because the Assassins really are the bad guys in this game. Initially, I kinda thought there wasn't meant to be a good or bad side in this game or conflict, but the Assassins want to remove the precursor boxes for reasons that are never really touched on, which leads to the destruction of cities and deaths of thousands of innocent lives. Like what happened in Lisbon, which is the whole reason Shay betrayed the Brotherhood in the first place. It feels a bit out of character for the Assassins. I guess they only wanted the boxes so the Templars couldn't have them, but really it feels like a sort of contrived reason so that we would take Shay and the Templars' side in Rogue. I feel the Assassins' motives could have been better explained and not make them look so stupid. Again, I think the concept is great, it's a unique and refreshing take on this conflict, but I wish they would have done it in a way that doesn't make the Assassins look pointlessly evil. Regardless, I still thoroughly enjoy Rogue's story, getting to see Hatham and more of how the Templars operate and their true purposes. It's one of the main draws to the game. But I feel Unity's story is also really underrated. Like, I know a lot of people love the gameplay and world, I do too, absolutely, but the story is better than I feel a lot of people give it credit for. I know everybody isn't a fan of the whole love story between Arno and Elise, and people don't like Arno constantly simping for her, but like I said in my review of the game, that's the whole point. Arno is supposed to be like that. It's part of his entire arc and development as a character, which we see the results of at the very end of the game and carried on into the Dead Kings DLC. Arno's story is very tragic. He lost his father, no thanks to Shay making his own luck at the start of the game, but you know, at least he still got oh, never mind. But at least it ended happily ever after with Elise. Oh dear. I for one really enjoyed Arno's journey and arc. I think it's extremely underrated. I love getting to see the process of becoming an assassin in the French Brotherhood. It's one of the few games where the Creed is fully operational and has tons of assassins. You get to see the council and how they assigned targets. I loved all of that stuff. Don't get me wrong, there's still some issues. Germain, for one, isn't the most intriguing antagonist, but there's some great moments in this story. I think Pierre Bellic, as much as people want to make fun of the fact that for some reason he has a Western accent in France, is a great character. A traditional assassin who doesn't believe peace with the Templars is ever possible, so he attempts to purge the leadership and start anew. That whole fight between him and Arno was great and showed a side to the assassins that makes sense. A lot of the assassins don't want peace, they want war with the Templars, and that was perfectly represented with Bellic. I think both of these games have phenomenal endings though. Rogue of course branches into the start of Unity with assassinating Charles Dorian, and Unity has this dark ending with Elise's death and Arno learning to move on and find his own purpose in life. Call me edgy or whatever, but I always liked the darker, more solemn endings in Assassin's Creed, where it doesn't always end happily ever after. Oh, and I nearly forgot. Both games have some pretty forgettable modern day storylines in the scope of the series. I think the time displacement parts in Unity are fun, but the story itself is practically non-existent. At the end, you basically find out that going through Arno's memories was pointless, since Germain's remains are with tons of others in these catacombs.
Well done, kid. I don't think Abstergo will bother searching the catacombs for Germain's body. The bones are gonna be too damaged, too decayed. We're in the clear at this stage.
Cool, glad we did all that for basically nothing then. Rogues at the very least has a story, even if it's not the most interesting. I think it's cool getting a little more insight into Abstergo with Otso Berg and the modern day Templars, even though it still doesn't really hold a candle to the Desmond era. I I think Unity has a distinct advantage when it comes to comparing gameplay, since Rogue's gameplay is nearly identical to Black Flag with a few new additions at best. I will say I really like the Assassin Stalker enemies. I think that's one of the best new additions it had. It fits really well with the narrative since you're obviously playing as a Templar hunting down assassins. It only makes sense that there'd be an assassin enemy type that can hide in bushes or on rooftops and do almost all the things we can do as players with stealth, parkour, and use of tools in the Hidden Blade. But most everything else, including the combat, stealth, parkour, and naval combat, is nearly identical to Black Flag, with some small changes with the weapon types and modified tools, like the air rifle for example. I like Black Flag's gameplay, so it's not a huge downside to me or anything, but I think when comparing it to a game like Unity that tried to innovate on the Assassin's Creed formula with new systems and animations, I generally enjoy the gameplay a lot more. Now, of course, the frustrating thing with Unity is it doesn't always work properly. I like what they tried to do with the new combat system, but it's not very polished. The stealth is an absolute blast and looks incredible when it works, and the parkour has some of the best looking animations, but isn't always the most responsive. Of course, the game is in a far better state than it was on launch, but I think we can all still agree it's not the most polished experience. Generally though, I enjoy Unity's gameplay more than Rogue's. Unity's gameplay really did feel like the natural evolution of the traditional formula to me, and while I enjoy playing Rogue, I've always far preferred Unity's gameplay regardless of the technical refinement. So if you've watched my video where I went in depth on Assassin's Creed Unity, you know it has one of my favorite open worlds in the entire series. I mean, there's a reason Baghdad from AC Mirage took Paris from Unity's world as an example of a lively, dense city. The atmosphere in Unity is unmatched for me in this series. The sheer number of NPCs alone makes it feel so lived in and immersive. There's riots and crowds all over the city with constant conversations. I like the world events, whether it's tackling a thief or killing criminals. Little things like that really add to the atmosphere. Rogue's setting admittedly is not quite as interesting as either the streets of Paris during the French Revolution or the vast Caribbean Sea of Black Flag. While I appreciate Rogue taking place in a more niche time period during the 7 Years' War and not just going for the most popular time periods, it just never was as intriguing of a setting for me personally. If you're like a huge history buff and really into the 7 Years' War, I can totally understand why you'd feel differently. That's one of the great things about this series. It has a lot of different time periods that people are very fond of. I mean, even I have a little bias towards Paris from Unity since I've been there and I have a lot of family from there, but that aside, Rogue's atmosphere just doesn't quite stack up to Unity's for me. I must say the environments look more bland to me as well, and it's not because of the graphics. Even compared to Black Flag, the cities and locations in that game felt more alive and vibrant. Everything in Rogue has a bit of a dull look to it. I also must say, for one, I prefer having these massive cities to traverse on foot and in parkour, as opposed to having to get on a boat to sail between different locations. I think it works great for Black Flag, but Rogue's world is a lot smaller and confined, so it doesn't quite have that freeing or exhilarating feeling Black Flag does. And again, I love parkour in this series, and Unity's world is just so well designed and built for it to keep it engaging and essential when traversing the world. I prefer Unity's side content as well because most of them have stories attached to them. A lot of the side content in Rogue doesn't have stories with them. A lot of it is defending someone, liberating an area, or intercepting an assassination. It's fun for a bit, but it gets old really quickly when there's no story to it, and you're doing a lot of the same quests constantly in different locations. I do really like the legendary ship battles though, but I feel Unity tried to make a lot of the missions more engaging by attaching little stories with them. Whether it's the co-op missions and heists, Paris stories, or even the murder mysteries, which are so underlooked. The murder mysteries are a lot of fun. Getting to investigate and check out clues, interrogate witnesses, and then decide for yourself who the guilty party is. All of which have a story and motive behind them. Now sure, there's some basic quests as well, like just simple Templar assassinations with no story whatsoever, but generally, I found the side content far more engaging than Rogue's. It has to be said that obviously Unity is a more visually pleasing game than Rogue. Even though Unity has been surpassed by the newer games in terms of visual fidelity, I still think this is one of the best looking AC games aesthetically speaking. I love the look of this game, and 8 years later, it still looks unbelievable. Rogue, of course, is the same age, but was built for the previous gen, so it of course has not aged quite as well. But Rogue is objectively the more polished game, even if it's not perfect. Unity on launch may have been more broken than my soul. As for the soundtracks, well, I feel that's one of the few consistently great things you can count on in any Assassin's Creed game. Obviously, music is very subjective to everybody, but I personally prefer the music in Unity, although Rogue's is still very good. I tend to find Unity's soundtrack more memorable. It does a great job of enforcing the tone and range of emotions within the game, from chasing around Elise as a kid to the intense battles. Rogue's soundtrack is great and has one of my favorite renditions of Ezio's family, but ultimately I do prefer Unity's. Like I said from the beginning, I'm very fond of both of these games, but there can only be one winner. And for me, the better game has to be Assassin's Creed Unity. You know me, I've been a Unity fanboy since day one. I think it did so much to try and innovate on the AC formula, and it has one of the best open worlds and atmospheres out of any AC game. Rogue has a fantastically unique narrative, although it still has its flaws, and ultimately, it didn't do enough new for me to consider it a better game than Unity, although I still really enjoy the game. But that's just my opinion, of course. Let me know which of these two games are better down in the comments and why. If you enjoyed the video, I've made tons of other which game is better videos for the Assassin's Creed series if you'd like to check them out. Click the card in the top right to see the whole playlist. As always, I'd greatly appreciate it if you considered leaving a like and subscribing to the channel if you're new. Thank you to my mentors for choosing to support the channel, and other than that, thanks for watching, and have a great rest of your day, Assassins.